The bracelet weighs almost nothing. 7 small turquoise beads threaded on sinew, with 2 tiny silver ones that catch afternoon light like captured stars. Lucy Swimmer had worked on it for 3 weeks, using techniques her grandmother taught her before the old woman died, before the family moved closer to town, before the war changed everything about how Cherokee children learned to be Cherokee in a world that seemed determined to forget they existed at all. Now the bracelet rests in the palm of a Japanese girl whose name Lucy doesn't know how to pronounce correctly, whose family lives behind the fence that cuts across what used to be farmland, whose presence in Oklahoma represents something adults argue about in hushed voices that stop when children enter rooms. But Emiko Tanaka doesn't see political complexity when she looks at the bracelet. She sees hours of careful work, the kind of attention to detail that her own grandmother prized when teaching traditional crafts, the particular patience required to create something beautiful from simple materials. She sees friendship offered without conditions, kindness extended across the invisible boundaries that adults use to separate people who children recognize as essentially similar. She closes her fingers around the beads and feels the weight of obligation settle in her chest. Not the obligation to keep a gift, but the more complicated responsibility of understanding what acceptance means, what reciprocity requires, what honor demands when someone offers you something precious in a world where most people seem determined to take everything away. The bracelet will travel from Lucy's hands to Emiko's palm and back again within 24 hours. But in that brief journey, it will carry a lesson about integrity that neither girl fully understands until decades later, when they're women with children of their own, trying to explain to another generation how honor functions in the spaces between cultures, how dignity survives in the gaps between official policies and human need, how 2 12-year-old girls in 1945 Oklahoma managed to solve moral problems that left their elders confused and bitter and afraid. This is not a story about charity crossing cultural boundaries. This is a story about recognition. The moment when Cherokee and Japanese traditions of honor discover they speak the same language, even when their speakers are too young to vote, too powerless to change laws, too innocent to understand why the adult world seems so determined to make friendship complicated and kindness controversial. Oklahoma, in 1945, carries the accumulated weight of multiple displacements, overlapping removals, the geographical evidence of what happens when federal policies treat human communities like problems to be solved through relocation and containment. The Cherokee Nation has spent over a century learning to survive in landscapes that weren't chosen, adapting traditional ways of life to territories that required new forms of resilience, maintaining cultural identity in the face of educational systems and governmental policies designed to eliminate that identity through efficiency rather than violence, through bureaucracy rather than warfare. By 1945, Cherokee families have developed sophisticated strategies for cultural preservation disguised as assimilation, for teaching traditional values through seemingly modern activities, for raising children who understand both how to navigate white institutions and how to remain Cherokee while doing so. The Jerome War Relocation Center sits like a temporary scar across Arkansas Delta farmland, housing 8,000 Japanese Americans in tar paper barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But Jerome is closing. The war is ending. Families are being transferred to other camps or released to communities willing to sponsor them, scattered across a country that hasn't decided whether they're welcome back, whether their citizenship was temporarily suspended or permanently revoked, whether the camps were a regrettable necessity or a foundational mistake that reveals something uncomfortable about American democracy under pressure. The children understand none of this political complexity. They understand only that their world keeps changing without their permission, that adults make decisions based on fears the children don't share, that friendship becomes complicated when governments decide who can live where and under what conditions. The meeting between Cherokee and Japanese children happens in the spaces between official attention, in the informal economies of childhood that develop whenever young people need to solve problems that adults have created but failed to address. Lucy Swimmer lives with her aunt's family on a small farm 20 miles from the camp, close enough that she sees the trains bringing new arrivals and taking others away, close enough that she hears the adult conversations about what the camp means for local communities, far enough away that the human faces behind the fence remain abstractions until the day she encounters 3 Japanese children walking along the creek that runs through her family's land. They're not supposed to be there. Camp regulations prohibit unsupervised travel beyond the perimeter. Local customs discourage contact between camp families and area residents. Everyone understands that mixing creates complications, questions, the kind of human sympathy that makes simple solutions impossible and simple explanations inadequate. But children follow their own logic. Edible plants don't recognize political boundaries. Traditional fishing spots don't relocate themselves to accommodate new fences. And 12-year-olds develop their own understanding of territory, their own calculations about risk and benefit, their own private negotiations with rules that seem designed more to maintain adult comfort than to address childhood realities. Emiko had been walking the creek with her younger brother and sister, looking for the kind of familiar plants that might supplement inadequate camp rations, searching for evidence that this strange landscape contained anything recognizable, anything that connected their displaced present to their interrupted past. She understood that they were outside permitted boundaries, that discovery could mean punishment for her family, that her parents' careful compliance with camp regulations was part of a larger strategy for survival that her adventures might compromise. But she also understood hunger, understood the particular boredom that develops when active children are confined to small spaces for extended periods, understood that sometimes the risks of breaking rules are smaller than the risks of following them. When Lucy appeared through the willows, Emiko's first instinct was to run. But something in the Cherokee girl's posture, curious rather than threatening, interested rather than hostile, made her pause. They regarded each other across 20 feet of creek water with the particular attention that children bring to unexpected encounters, each trying to calculate whether the other represented danger or possibility, whether this meeting would complicate their respective situations or create new opportunities for the kind of connection that childhood requires but adulthood often prevents. Lucy spoke first, not in English but in Cherokee, a soft greeting that her grandmother had taught her for encountering strangers in traditional territory. The words meant something like, "I see you, and you are welcome in this place, if you come with good intentions." Emiko didn't understand the language, but she understood the tone, the quality of respect and careful welcome that transcended specific vocabulary. She responded with a formal bow, the kind her own grandmother had taught her for acknowledging hospitality, for demonstrating that she recognized kindness and intended to reciprocate it. The conversation that followed happened mostly in gestures, in the shared language of children who need to communicate across linguistic boundaries that adults haven't taught them to bridge. They established names, ages, family composition through the universal childhood protocols of introduction. They shared observations about the creek, about edible plants, about the technical challenges of catching small fish with improvised equipment. They discovered that both had grandmothers who taught traditional crafts, that both understood the difference between taking from the land and accepting what the land offered, that both had been raised with protocols for reciprocity and respect that seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world where adults made decisions based on fear rather than relationship. When Lucy offered the bracelet, Emiko understood immediately that she was being given something precious. The careful workmanship, the traditional materials, the hours of patient attention required to create something beautiful from simple components. These were gifts that carried obligation, that required appropriate response, that established relationship rather than simply marking transaction. In Japanese tradition, such gifts create debt that must be honored through reciprocity, through the careful attention to balance and mutual obligation that keeps communities stable across generations. But Emiko had nothing equivalent to offer in return. The camp provided basic necessities but few materials for craftwork. Her family's possessions had been reduced to what could fit in suitcases and duffel bags, practical items rather than beautiful ones, survival equipment rather than cultural treasures. The bracelet felt heavier in her palm than its actual weight suggested. Not because of the beads and sinew, but because of everything the gift represented. Lucy's trust in offering something precious to a stranger. The Cherokee traditions of hospitality and welcome that made such generosity possible. The assumption that friendship could be established across cultural and political boundaries that adults insisted were unbridgeable. The implication that Emiko was worthy of such trust, such welcome, such friendship. Implications that contradicted everything the camp experience had taught her about her family's place in American society. That night, in the barracks she shared with her parents and grandparents, Emiko turned the bracelet over in her hands and thought about honor. Her grandmother had taught her that accepting gifts created responsibilities, that kindness required appropriate response, that the failure to reciprocate generosity was a form of theft that damaged both the receiver and the giver. But her grandmother had also taught her that some gifts are too precious to keep, that accepting what cannot be properly honored is itself a form of disrespect, that true appreciation sometimes requires the courage to return what has been offered in friendship. The decision crystallized slowly, through the long night of consideration that important moral choices require. Emiko understood that Lucy had offered the bracelet in friendship, that returning it might be interpreted as rejection, that the Cherokee girl might feel hurt or confused by the gesture. But she also understood that keeping something precious without being able to reciprocate appropriately was a form of taking rather than receiving, a violation of the protocols of exchange that both their grandmothers had taught them to respect. The next morning, Emiko retraced her steps to the creek, carrying the bracelet in a small cloth pouch that had belonged to her grandmother, one of the few traditional items that had survived the forced sale of their family's possessions before internment. She found Lucy exactly where she expected to, checking the fish traps they had improvised together the day before, working with the patient attention that good fishing requires. When Emiko offered the bracelet back, Lucy's initial reaction was confusion, then hurt, then the beginning of anger that children feel when their generosity is rejected without explanation. But Emiko's formal bow, the careful presentation of the bracelet in its cloth wrapping, the obvious reluctance with which she made the gesture, these details suggested something more complex than simple rejection. Lucy accepted the returned bracelet and waited for explanation, understanding that important gestures require appropriate response rather than immediate reaction. Emiko's explanation came slowly, in the mixed English and gesture that had become their common language. She spoke about grandmother's teachings, about the obligations that gifts create, about the difference between accepting kindness and honoring kindness properly. She explained that keeping the bracelet without being able to reciprocate would dishonor both Lucy's generosity and her own family's traditions of respectful exchange. She emphasized that the return was not rejection, but recognition, not ingratitude, but the deepest form of appreciation, the acknowledgement that the gift was too precious to accept lightly, too meaningful to keep without proper reciprocity. Lucy listened with the careful attention that children bring to moral complexity. trying to understand concepts that her own cultural training had prepared her for, but never required her to apply in such circumstances. Cherokee traditions included protocols for gift exchange, for the proper balance between giving and receiving, for the ways that generosity created relationships rather than simply marked transactions. What Emiko described was not rejection but honor, not ingratitude, but the kind of respectful consideration that recognized the true value of what had been offered. When Lucy accepted the returned bracelet, she did so with a deeper understanding of what the original gift had meant, what accepting it would have required, what returning it demonstrated about Emiko's character and cultural training. The Japanese girl's explanation had transformed a simple gesture of friendship into a lesson about integrity, about the difference between taking and receiving, about the moral complexity that develops when generous impulses meet principled responses. The second exchange, when Lucy offered the bracelet again with explicit permission to keep it without reciprocal obligation, carried different weight than the first. Not the casual generosity of childhood friendship, but the formal recognition of honor demonstrated, respect acknowledged, integrity appreciated across cultural boundaries. When Emiko accepted the bracelet the second time, she did so understanding that the gift had been transformed by its return, that the Cherokee girl now offered it not simply in friendship, but in recognition of moral courage, not as casual kindness, but as formal acknowledgement of character demonstrated through difficult choice. The story of the returned bracelet traveled through both communities in the way that important moral lessons always do, quietly, carefully, through networks of adults who understood that some childhood wisdom deserves preservation and transmission. Among Cherokee families, Lucy's account of the Japanese girl who understood proper protocols for gift exchange became evidence that some camp residents had been raised with traditional values, that cultural boundaries could be crossed without being violated. That respect was a language that transcended the artificial divisions created by war and politics and official fear. Among Japanese families in the camp, Emiko's careful explanation of why she returned and then accepted the bracelet became part of the informal curriculum of cultural preservation, the ongoing effort to maintain traditional values in circumstances designed to eliminate them. The children learned that integrity required difficult choices, that honor sometimes meant accepting loss rather than taking gain, that respect for others' generosity required honest assessment of one's ability to reciprocate appropriately. The war ended 6 months later. The camps closed. Families scattered to rebuild lives in communities that had learned to live without them, or didn't want them back, or welcomed them with the careful politeness that conceals continuing suspicion. Emiko and her family moved to California, where they worked other people's farms until they could save enough to lease land of their own. Lucy finished growing up on her aunt's farm, learned to navigate the complexities of Cherokee identity in a rapidly changing world, raised children who understood both how to preserve traditional ways and how to adapt them to new circumstances. But they carried the memory of the bracelet, offered, returned, accepted again, like a piece of practical wisdom about the relationship between generosity and integrity, about the difference between taking and receiving, about the moral courage required to honor others' kindness appropriately, even when that honor requires personal sacrifice. When their own children asked about making friends across cultural boundaries, about accepting gifts from people different from themselves, about the relationship between gratitude and reciprocity, both women told the story of a Cherokee bracelet that taught two 12-year-old girls more about honor than most adults learn in lifetimes of political and cultural conflict. The bracelet itself disappeared eventually, lost or broken or given away in the normal course of living, but the lesson it carried persisted through generations of children who learned that honor functions independently of adult politics, that integrity requires consistent application regardless of circumstances, that respect creates relationships that transcend the artificial boundaries that fear and official policy use to keep people separated from their common humanity. Sometimes the most important gifts are the ones we return. Sometimes honor requires the courage to acknowledge that we cannot reciprocate kindness appropriately, that accepting generosity without proper response is itself a form of taking rather than receiving. Sometimes two children solve moral problems that leave their elders confused and bitter, creating bridges across cultural boundaries that politics insists are unbridgeable, demonstrating that respect is a language older than the divisions that separate us. If stories like this remind you that children often understand honor more clearly than adults understand politics, that integrity creates relationships that transcend artificial boundaries, then perhaps there are other moments of unexpected moral courage worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges require us to choose between easy gratitude and honest honor.